On the morning of September 27, the weather was cold and clear at Camp 1. The climbers were relieved that the wind had died down, as the previous day showed signs of clearing up, but they had chosen to stay put. They did not want to waste energy climbing to Camp 2 only to be thwarted by another brief break in the post-monsoon winds. What they needed was a sustained period of calm weather. Despite the uncertainty, the group was excited and determined as they marched up the neve of the Rongbuk Glacier toward the base of the face and the start of the fixed ropes. Their rest at Camp 1 had given Hall time to recover from his respiratory ailment, and his return was a morale booster for the team. With his experience and skill, he was essential to their small and vulnerable group. Upon arriving at Camp 2, they settled into their snow cave for the night before tackling White Limbo and the Great Couloir the following day. However, their hopes were once again dashed by the weather. Throughout the night, the wind grew stronger, howling across the North Face of Everest. They were reluctant to retreat to Camp 1, aware that the frequent up and down trips were sapping their energy. They sensed that it would be a mistake to descend this time, fearing they might not have enough energy to ascend again. Morale began to decline as the enforced rest days dragged on. Hall expressed that it was acceptable to fail to climb a mountain because of technical difficulty or inadequate strength, but returning home without attempting to reach the summit due to unfavorable weather conditions was intolerable. After 3 days of inactivity at Camp 2, the burning drive to succeed in adversity began to wane. The fierce wind on the north side of Everest worsened during the night but unexpectedly died down in the morning. The 5 climbers took the opportunity to move higher up the mountain, following the ropes fixed on White Limbo. Although the snow had consolidated, climbing was slow and difficult due to the climbers' weight and heavy packs. Bartram's summit attempt ended halfway up the slope when he experienced symptoms of cerebral edema, a serious condition that can result in death if not promptly addressed. He quickly diagnosed himself and descended to Camp 2, offloading his communal gear to Henderson. The mountain was already beginning to select the eventual summit team. As the afternoon progressed, the team reached the end of the fixed ropes at the top of White Limbo, retrieved their gear that had been stashed there weeks earlier, and began crossing the slopes towards the Great Couloir. Having ascended more than 600 meters, they found a natural snow cave formed by a partially open crevasse, allowing them to sleep in it. The next day brought gentle gusts of icy wind, but nothing like the continuous gales from earlier. A period of decent weather had arrived, and this was just the break the climbers were waiting for. Slowly, the team began the exhausting haul up the Couloir. Although the climbing was not difficult, it was certainly not without danger. The face's angle was about 45 degrees, not steep enough to require a rope and belay. The snow was firm, bordering on icy, perfect for crampons. However, the hard snow meant that any slip or fall could be fatal. A sliding climber would have little hope of using their axe to arrest their fall. Despite its spectacular position and awesome views, climbing the Great Couloir had few elements of pleasure, as Hall recalled. Half my mind concentrated on keeping my balance and on other fine points of not falling off. There was not enough oxygen for my mind to cope with more than those few thoughts. Shortly, the angle of the slope eased to about 40 degrees. Looking up, the snow slope seemed endless. Somewhere above the Couloir, it merged into steep rock, but that was too far away to worry about. All I could do was to take one step and make sure it was followed by another. 20 steps, then a rest, then 20 steps again. The walls of rock flanking the Couloir began to close in, bringing with them a feeling of hostility. It was no place for humans. There was no air, no water, no hope. I shook my head and fought away the pressure of those negative thoughts. The climbers slowly made their way toward the top of the Great Couloir. Macartney-Snape and Mortimer searched for a campsite as the afternoon progressed and the temperature dropped. Unfortunately, they could not find a ready-made snow cave and had to settle for an angled spur where they could level a ledge for their tent. They had reached a height of approximately 8,150 meters that day, higher than any of them had ever been before and well within the death zone. Despite the challenging conditions, they did their best to consume liquids and food to maintain their strength and cope with the cramped quarters and lack of oxygen. The weather seemed stable in the morning, and there was little wind around the tent. It was October 3, 1984, more than 62 years after Australian George Ingle Finch pushed for the top in the same area. This day would be the Australians' only attempt, as they knew they did not have the strength for another try. Numb from the intense cold and slowed by the lack of oxygen, Mortimer led the way, followed by Macartney-Snape and Henderson. The climbers had to traverse across the width of the Great Couloir and up toward the rock band. Although the climbing was straightforward, it was painstakingly slow at that altitude. The rock band was in deep shade and likely to remain cold throughout the day, so the climbers chose to traverse over to the yellow band, which was in the sun. Upon reaching the yellow band, Macartney-Snape took the lead and ascended a natural ramp composed of a combination of rock and ice, or, as Macartney-Snape described it, bad snow on poor rock. Climbing beyond the ramp proved to be a daunting and hazardous task. Macartney-Snape secured Mortimer by dropping a rope as he climbed the steep rock section. Still, by the time Henderson arrived at the same point, the other two had already climbed too far ahead to provide any additional support. Consequently, Henderson had to climb the section without any assistance. In the meantime, Hall had decided to turn back. Despite being the last to leave the tent, he had taken his time traversing across the couloir and had begun to feel that his body was not warming up. Hall had been struggling with cold hands and feet throughout the climb, and given his experience of losing 2 toes after spending 2 nights on the summit ridge of Dunajiri 6 years ago, he did not want to risk getting frostbite again. Upon surpassing the yellow band, Macartney-Snape and Mortimer conquered their biggest challenge. However, what remained was a morale-sapping battle against fatigue, lack of oxygen, and fading light. Despite the tantalizing closeness of the summit, time was running out rapidly. Macartney-Snape had brought a small tape recorder and described the tremendous effort required to climb even the easiest terrain above 8,500 meters. You do 6 steps, and you're totally exhausted, breath just can't come out any faster. Your whole being is just absorbed in the task of breathing. This is going to be the hardest day of my life, physically and mentally. The summit is somewhere up there. How far? I'm not quite sure, but the sun is sinking fast, and we've got to make it before sunset. At dusk, Tim Macartney-Snape achieved the remarkable feat of becoming the first Australian to summit Mount Everest. Greg Mortimer soon joined him, but Macartney-Snape's achievement was particularly impressive since most climbers can barely function upon reaching the summit. Macartney-Snape had carried a movie camera and tape recorder and even made a speech about the environment and nuclear war. Meanwhile, Henderson stopped just short of the summit due to a broken crampon, which he had to repair at the cost of frostbite, resulting in losing his fingers. Descending from the summit was perhaps even more challenging for the trio, especially in the intense cold and darkness. They managed to traverse to the top of the Great Couloir but had no snow stakes to anchor their descent. Macartney-Snape improvised by using an aluminum stave from Mortimer's pack, burying it in the snow to serve as an anchor. Henderson's fingers were useless, Mortimer was exhausted, and even Macartney-Snape found mundane tasks exceedingly difficult after their grueling climb. One by one, the climbers stumbled into the tent, with Henderson last. There were hugs and tears of joy and relief, but Henderson's severely frostbitten hands took the shine off the celebrations. Macartney-Snape, Mortimer, and Henderson were able to drift off to sleep, but Hall had problems. At that height, I found the dark claustrophobic. Sleep was supposed to be a state of rest, but instead, as I dozed and my respiratory rate dropped, I plunged into a frightening world of suffocation. Opening my eyes did not relieve the panic because the darkness continued. Only in the morning did the team fully realize their precarious situation. Macartney-Snape could descend on his own, but Mortimer and Henderson needed help. Hall and Macartney-Snape packed Henderson's gear and divided his belongings, preparing him for the descent. Henderson's hands had frozen in a gripping position, but they were easily pried open to insert the ice axe. He was able to descend without further assistance. Mortimer, however, was in serious trouble. He was semi-conscious and unable to get himself ready to descend. Hall and Macartney-Snape had to attach crampons to his boots, but Mortimer moved slowly. He was either extremely exhausted or suffering from cerebral edema. Hall began the descent with Mortimer, but Macartney-Snape soon overtook them. They settled for a night in the crevasse just above the ice cliffs. In the morning, Mortimer was slightly better and could prepare himself for the day's climbing. He set out before Hall for the traverse across White Limbo. The descent went without incident, and by nightfall, Hall was back on the glacier with Colin Monteith. Mortimer was just above on the fixed ropes, and Henderson had already descended from Camp 2. Macartney-Snape had climbed down from Camp 4 to the glacier in Camp 1 in a single afternoon. The ordeal was over for everyone except Henderson, who would later lose parts of all of his fingers. The Australian expedition's ascent to Everest was exceptional by any measure. They climbed the world's highest peak in a clean and stylish manner, without supplemental oxygen, and even established a new route. Macartney-Snape and Mortimer's summit climb exemplified near-ideal alpine style. They established only one camp on the north face, a snow cave at 6,900 m, and carried most of what they needed for the summit attempt on their backs. Despite the difficulties, the Australian climbers accomplished a phenomenal achievement. Of the 5 climbers who set out from Sydney, 2 reached the summit, 1 came close, 1 climbed beyond the highest camp, and only 1 failed to get within striking distance of the summit. Considering the usual attrition rate due to illness, fatigue, burnout, and altitude sickness on Everest, this was a remarkable accomplishment.